Okay, so in honor of Pride Month, I want to tell you about the lesbian who basically saved Hollywood. And I'm not being facetious or metaphorical, like, oh, she inspired a generation, but like she actually invented something on a film set that revolutionized the way that films are made to this day. And her name is Dorothy Arzner. And there's a very good chance that you've never heard of her, which is honestly really criminal. And I remember talking to a friend of mine who works in the film industry a couple months ago. He went to school for this and he lived in LA for 10 years and like did the whole thing. And he looked at me and he was like, how have I never heard of Dorothy Arzner? Like, why weren't we taught this in school? I was like, I don't know. The patriarchy, probably. So pull up a chair. Get yourself something warm to drink because this is going to be a good one. To really understand and appreciate Dorothy, we have to talk about and understand what Hollywood was like in the 1920s and 1930s when she was coming up in and working in Hollywood. Sometimes when we think about the old times, we think of them being very conservative and very stuffy. And while that is true for certain generations and certain decades, the 1920s and early teens in Hollywood, California were not one of those times. It was the Roaring 20s for a reason. The Hays Code, the censorship code, did not exist yet and would not exist until 1932. And even then, it wouldn't really fully go into effect for another few years. Hollywood in the early teens and 20s was a bunch of weirdos and artsy people from New York kind of blowing in, and there was just this expectation that this new art form was also going to be comprised of a bunch of artsy weirdos. We had not yet developed this kind of weird sanitized expectation of our artists from Hollywood. Cough, this is because of brand deals and money and the man. Versus theater. When we go to a theater show, we expect there to be a bunch of little gay weirdos running things, right? And to perfection. But when we think about going to films nowadays, there's this sort of sanitization of it. There's this kind of rough. We've got Rambo, we've got this, we've got that. We've got Tom Cruise pretending to be tough. Like, there's all of these. Sorry that you're catching strays, Tom Cruise, but like, you're fine. The point is, due to the commercialization of the art form that has since happened because of how successful and financially lucrative it turned out to be, when we think of film, it has changed a lot since its initial inception when people didn't know how it was going to pan out. And when Dorothy Arzner started working in Hollywood, it was comprised of a bunch of weirdos, and that was expected because you were working with artists, and that was a known quantity of working with artsy people. And when Dorothy Arzner first started working in Hollywood, there were still silent films. There was not sound yet being used universally. There was this sort of frenetic, exciting energy going on in Hollywood as people were pouring in from all over the country, and hopefuls were going to audition for studios, and people were making their mark on an industry that they didn't even yet know what it was going to be. And there were a lot of doors that were wide open to walk through that would later end up getting slammed shut. Things in the industry began to pick up even more in the late 1920s with the introduction of the talkie or sound film, because technology had finally caught up to where they could actually record audio and sync it up with the tape to give audiences a brand new sensory experience. However, what this also means is that all of the studios all at once were now rushing to put out the first and the best and the most exciting sound film with crews and actors who had perfected the silent film and spent years doing so. And that is a completely different style of acting. That is a completely different need from a crew. Think about the quiet on set. That hadn't been a thing yet. No one had to be quiet on those sets, right? So there's this whole world that was evolving and just kind of exploding all at once. And while it was exciting and invigorating, it was also terrifying, and it meant that a lot of people found their careers ending overnight. If you're familiar with the movie Singing in the Rain, it touches on this a lot because not all silent film actors had incredible speaking voices that were pleasing to the ear, and if they weren't able to make the transition and if the audiences weren't able to accept them, they were done. Paramount Pictures was around at this time, and they were also charging full steam ahead to get a sound picture out, and that brings us to 1929, when they had begun production on The Wild Party, which was to be their first sound feature. They cast it girl Clara Bow as the lead. Yes, that Clara Bow. Thank you, Taylor Swift, for bringing her back into the cultural zeitgeist. She was, as many of you probably know, the original it girl. That phrase was coined because of Clara Bow, and that was how the press would talk about her. She just had this essence and this star quality about her that audiences just ate up and were obsessed with. But Clara Bow, like every other actor in Hollywood up to this point, had only ever done silent films. So this was going to be a huge undertaking for her. And of course, for the director, they chose the incomparable Dorothy Arzner. So let's back up and talk a little bit about Dorothy Arzner for a second, because that's what we're here for, right? So she was born in 1897 in San Francisco, and she grew up in Los Angeles. Her father owned a restaurant there that was frequented by a lot of Hollywood professionals. So she grew up just kind of hearing shop talk all around her and seeing this really exciting industry kind of exploding before her eyes as she was growing up. Now, interestingly, before she got into film, she wanted to go into medicine because she wanted to help people. And at the time, that was not a very popular career choice for women. However, her parents did support her in that. She just ultimately ended up deciding to go into film instead. She was also known to have this sort of uncontrollable energy about her growing up, where she was constantly wearing trousers and wearing boys' clothes, and her parents just couldn't really stop her. They were like, it's just Dorothy. She's just Dorothy. We can't really, she was this good kid, but she just was unable to stop being her authentic self. And I do think that it's notable that she went from wanting to do one career that was not at all dominated by females, which was in the medical field, and then switched over to directing, which is also at the time, and honestly even still to this day, not very populated by women. She didn't start as a director though. She actually started as a typist at Paramount, typing in scripts. And from there, she moved on to editing, and she had a reputation for being able to save films with her creative editing skills. So she wasn't just cutting and pasting, she was actually applying her own creativity and storytelling abilities to work on the films that she was editing. And by the mid-1920s, she was one of the best editors in Hollywood. She was known for getting things done fast, getting them done under budget, and for, on more than one occasion, saving them from having to go back and do reshoots with her creative overlays. Paramount started throwing her a bunch of B pictures. And interestingly enough, Dorothy wanted to be taken so seriously in the film industry that many of the original films that she edited, she refused to be credited as, because she didn't want people to judge it thinking, oh, a woman did this or that. And I think that's really interesting. Also, if you think about that, there's so many films that Dorothy Arzner worked on that we will just never know because she didn't want to be credited. When she started directing at Paramount, they were kind of throwing her these kind of women films that they would think of, kind of like a rom-com or this or that, these sort of lighthearted fluff pieces. And nothing that was considered an A picture that was getting the main attention of the studio and the main funding of the studio at that time. And Dorothy, being the smart business person that she is, she went to Columbia and got a competing offer from them to direct an A picture. And she went back to Paramount and she said, hey, I'd really like to direct an A picture with you, but if you won't let me, I will go to Columbia. And Paramount said, you know what? How about The Wild Party? And she said, I'll take it. Thank you very much. By the time she started working with Clara Bow on The Wild Party, she was already known as a star maker in Hollywood, having worked with greats such as Katharine Hepburn, Lucille Ball, and Maureen O'Hara, just to name a few. And she was known for pulling out these really incredible, authentic, truthful performances from these stars that cemented them as the Hollywood legends that they would go on to be. When production started on The Wild Party, It went without saying that this was going to be an incredibly high-pressure production and that there was a lot riding on this. Expectations were high, emotions were high, and for Clara Bow, she was having a difficult time adjusting to being on a soundstage. Silent film acting was known for its freedom. You think of Charlie Chaplin, there's a lot of physicality, there's a lot of moving around and freedom to move within the frame of the shot. And suddenly there are mics on the set that she has to be mindful of to only talk in certain directions, to only look in certain directions. And she wasn't used to having to think about all that, as well as thinking about a character, as well as remembering lines for the first time. It was a lot, and she wasn't doing great. The process of acclimating to having mics around was definitely not helped by the fact that one of them actually exploded on the set of The Wild Party near Clara right before a take. And she became so jittery and nervous that she wasn't able to continue on filming. And she and Dorothy kind of had a little side chat talking about what they could do to keep things rolling, because Dorothy was known for keeping things on schedule and under budget, and she didn't want that to change just because they were doing a sound film. That made Dorothy such an incredible director was that she actually listened to her actresses. She didn't dismiss them or tell them they were making too big a deal out of it. Like, she could have told Claire, you just need to figure it out. There's a lot riding on this. But instead, she listened to her, she heard her concerns, and she brainstormed a solution that day. What did she do? She attached a microphone to a fishing pole and instructed one of the crew members to hold it over Clara's head and to essentially follow her. I don't know if you figured it out yet, but that was the very first iteration of the boom mic. The boom mic that we see in every production. You see it in the blooper reels where the mic will dip down. She invented that, and it was patented after The Wild Party because of how wildly successful it was. The Wild Party came out in late 1929 and was received really well, to the relief of everyone involved. Clara's reviews were ultimately mixed, with some people being unsure about how they felt hearing her brusque Brooklyn accent for the first time, as people had kind of been free to imagine what Clara sounded like, and a girl from Brooklyn wasn't necessarily high on the list of what they thought their it girl sounded like. But Variety, yes, Variety has been around since the invention of the boom mic, gave her a review that was a bit of a backhanded compliment, but was more than most silent film stars could hope for at that time, which is Variety said that they believed that Clara would ultimately survive the transition into sound, and this is true, she did. And The Wild Party specifically is considered to be one of those films that really launched Clara Bow's career and gave her this sort of legendary star status. And as we've talked about earlier, this was something Dorothy was known for. This was also a career-cementing moment for Dorothy, as this won her a lot of respect and credit with the studio. Dorothy went on to direct over 18 films throughout her career, and she was the first woman to be accepted into the Directors Guild of America. Dorothy Arzner retired from directing in 1943 and was widely forgotten for a period as she lived out the rest of her years with her partner Marion Morgan, who she lived with for over 40 years before Marion died. I think it's really notable that throughout her career, she didn't try to hide who she was. She was wearing suits, she was dressing androgynously, and she was showing up to these meetings with these Hollywood bigwigs like, and what? What are you going to do about it? And she knew she was good, and she knew that they needed her. And it was no secret in Hollywood that she was with Marion. She would bring her to events with her and to premieres. Dorothy was just Dorothy, and she didn't ask for permission to step into the room as she was. And even with such an illustrious and fascinating career, she went largely forgotten until the mid-1970s, when film historians and feminist scholars started going through some archive footage and realizing how incredible her career had actually been. The Directors Guild of America went back and honored her, and film schools started including her in their curriculum. She died in 1979, but it's really beautiful that she lived long enough to see the recognition come pouring in from an industry that she gave so many years of her life to. And up until she died, she was also teaching at UCLA. She was a queer woman in 1920s Hollywood and navigating the natural obstacles that kind of came up alongside that. And she also managed to grow her career during the Hays Code crackdown through the 30s, which is really incredible when you think about it. And I would love to do I'd love to do an offshoot deep dive on the Hays Code in general, because the impact of that censorship on Hollywood really is what brought us into the more conservative 40s and 50s in the media people were consuming. So the next time you watch a movie or a TV show and you hear crystal clear audio, think about Dorothy Arzner on a film set somewhere in 1929 tying a microphone to a fishing pole, because that's who you have to thank. And if you're looking for a good Dorothy Arzner film to watch, you could watch Wild Party. However, one of my personal favorites is Dance Girl Dance, and I highly recommend you checking it out. She was known for putting fully formed, interesting women characters on screen at a time where they were seen as kind of one-dimensional set decor. But she deserves to be remembered all year round, but especially on Pride Month.